History is filled with great wars, monumental revolutions, and fierce battles that shape the course of nations and empires. These events are often remembered for their magnitude, their consequences, and their dramatic narratives. However, hidden among these momentous chapters of human history are stories of conflicts that are far less glorious, less consequential, and sometimes downright absurd. These are wars that began for trivial reasons, were fought half-heartedly, and ended with little or no change to the status quo. In many cases, the participants themselves might have struggled to explain why the conflict occurred in the first place. This project explores 10 of the most pointless wars ever recorded. Some lasted a single day, others dragged on for years. Some were sparked by misunderstandings or petty insults, others were the product of bureaucratic inertia or symbolic posturing. Despite the different causes and contexts, all these wars share one thing in common. They achieved nothing of lasting value. What makes these conflicts worth studying isn't their strategic brilliance or historical importance. Rather, it's their absurdity. They serve as reminders of how easily societies can drift into conflict over minor provocations or exaggerated pride. They also reveal the human tendency to apply the gravest of solutions, of violence, to the most trivial of problems. Take, for instance, the so-called War of the Bucket, a conflict between two Italian city-states over a stolen wooden bucket. Or the War of Jenkins Ear, sparked by the severing of an English merchant's ear by Spanish sailors. These are not tales of glory and sacrifice, but of ego and escalation, bureaucracy and stubbornness. They demonstrate that while war is often thought of as a calculated instrument of policy, it can just as easily be the product of folly. This document presents each war in a calm and even tone, using short sentences and clear, meditative language. The goal is not to dramatize or romanticize these events, but to present them as they are, curious footnotes in the grand book of history. This style is especially suited for audio narration, particularly for listeners seeking a peaceful and steady rhythm, such as those trying to fall asleep. Each section includes background context, a summary of events, notable anecdotes, and outcomes, or lack thereof. The structure allows for small pauses between paragraphs to encourage relaxation and maintain a slow, steady pace. There are no sudden changes in tone or tempo. The aim is not to keep listeners on edge, but to let them drift into a quiet reflection, possibly even sleep, as they absorb these strange and often forgotten historical episodes. The listener is invited to imagine these stories unfolding not as epic struggles, but as curious moments. Instances where human behavior, shaped by pride, fear, or confusion, led to confrontation without purpose. Through this lens, even war becomes strangely mundane. In total, the content of this text is intended to span approximately 20,000 words, covering 10 wars, each with its own chapter. The first of these will be the infamous War of the Bucket, which took place in Italy during the early 14th century. A war that started over a stolen pail and resulted in a siege, a battle, and the deaths of hundreds, yet accomplished nothing. As we move forward, keep in mind the central question: why do people sometimes choose violence over reason, even when there is so little to gain? Let us begin. In the early 14th century, Italy was not a unified nation. It was a collection of city-states, principalities, duchies, and kingdoms, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. Among them, two powerful northern cities, Modena and Bologna, stood as rivals, both culturally and politically. Their animosity was rooted in a broader political conflict that divided much of Europe, the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs supported the Pope. The Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna was a stronghold of the Guelphs. Modena was a center for the Ghibellines. This ideological divide often served as a convenient excuse for local disputes, and tensions between the two cities flared frequently. But in 1325, things took a particularly strange turn. It began with a wooden bucket. According to the most repeated version of the story, Modenese soldiers sneaked into Bologna and stole a wooden bucket from a city well. They brought it back to Modena as a trophy. At first glance, it seems ridiculous. A bucket? Yet in the context of medieval honor culture, it was a deep insult. The well was a symbol of Bologna's public life. The bucket, though humble, was a part of that symbol. Its theft was an affront to civic pride. Bologna demanded the return of the bucket. Modena refused. The matter could have ended there. But neither side wanted to appear weak. The dispute escalated. Within weeks, armies were being raised. Alliances were reaffirmed. And soon, war was declared. Both cities had considerable military forces for their time. Bologna gathered around 32,000 men. Modena mustered about 7,000. Though outnumbered, Modena had better coordination, better leadership, and the advantage of being on the defensive. Tension simmered throughout the summer of 1325. Skirmishes occurred along the borderlands. Envoys were sent, but talks quickly collapsed. Each side accused the other of acting dishonorably. Propaganda spread rapidly. The bucket, now a war symbol, was displayed prominently in Modena's city hall. In November, the Bolognese army advanced toward the Modenese border. Their target, the castle of Zappolino. The battle took place on November 15, 1325. It is the only major confrontation of the war. Despite their numerical advantage, the Bolognese forces were poorly coordinated and unprepared for the terrain. Modena, led by Passerino Bonacolsi, launched a surprise counterattack. The Bolognese lines quickly collapsed. Chaos spread. Many fled before fighting even began. By the end of the day, over 2,000 Bolognese were either dead or captured. Modena suffered minimal casualties. It was a decisive victory. The Modenese forces then marched toward Bologna, stopping just short of its gates. As a final insult, they dug a trench to reroute a nearby canal, depriving Bologna of water for several days. Then they returned home, triumphant. And the bucket? It remained in Modena. Despite the battle's impact, the war itself did not reshape the region. There were no significant territorial changes. No great treaties. No long-term shifts in power. Bologna never retrieved its bucket. Modena kept it as a war trophy. It was placed in a tower and put on public display. That bucket, an ordinary piece of wood and iron, became a historical artifact. Over time, the war became something of a joke. Poets mocked it. Scholars debated whether it even qualified as a real war. But records confirm the battle, the casualties, and the political consequences, however short-lived. Today, visitors to Modena can still see the bucket. It is displayed in the Torre della Ghirlandina, a medieval bell tower in the city centre. Whether or not it is the original remains a topic of quiet debate. The War of the Bucket is remembered not for its military strategy, but for its absurdity. It serves as a symbol of how pride, politics, and symbolism can escalate into real conflict. In a world that often seeks grand narratives and clear moral lessons, the War of the Bucket offers something different. It asks us to consider how often human beings allow trivial matters to grow into larger disputes. In many ways, the war was a medieval farce played out with real weapons and real consequences. And yet, it feels oddly timeless. Sometimes, it seems, we still fight over buckets. In the early 18th century, tension simmered between two global empires, Britain and Spain. These were not quiet disputes. These were low, ever-burning fires across oceans, fueled by colonial rivalries, trade disputes, and national pride. The Caribbean was one of the main theaters. A place of sun, sugar, and smuggling. Spain sought to control its colonies with strict trade laws. British merchants, eager for profit, frequently violated them. They smuggled goods into Spanish territories. Spain tried to stop them. They used coast guards known as guardacostas. These were not always professional sailors. Often, they were brutal, impatient, and sometimes violent. In 1731, a British merchant named Robert Jenkins was sailing near the coast of Havana, Cuba. His ship, the Rebecca, was intercepted by a Spanish patrol boat. The Spaniards boarded it, suspecting Jenkins of smuggling. They searched the vessel. Then came the moment that would start a war. According to Jenkins, the Spanish captain drew a sword and sliced off his ear. Then, with a grim flourish, handed it back to him. "Tell your king," the captain reportedly said, "that the same will happen to him if he dares the same." The mutilated ear was pickled in alcohol. Preserved. And then, for years, forgotten, the ear incident might have remained just another cruel story from the high seas. But in 1738, it returned. Jenkins appeared before the British Parliament. He held a jar containing his severed ear. It was a theatrical moment. The members were shocked, outraged. Some claimed the ear was a fake. Others demanded retribution. This was the spark. But the fire had already been building. Trade disputes, political factions, colonial greed. The ear gave them a symbol. A reason to go to war. The British press latched onto the story. Pamphlets circulated. Plays were written. And the phrase of Jenkins' ear became infamous. An entire war would soon bear its name. War was officially declared in 1739. Britain launched attacks on Spanish possessions in the Caribbean and Central America. The first major action was the assault on Portobello in Panama. It was a stunning success. The British fleet, under Admiral Edward Vernon, captured the port quickly. The victory was celebrated across Britain. Songs were written. Coins were minted. Vernon became a national hero. Even George Washington's family would name their Virginia estate Mount Vernon in his honor. But the early triumphs did not last. The reasons were simple: tropical disease, poor planning, and stubborn Spanish defense. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the British troops. Over 18,000 soldiers and sailors died. Most never even reached the battlefield. The Spanish commander, Blas de Lezo, was a formidable leader. One-eyed, one-armed, and one-legged, he became a legend in Spain for his victory. The British retreated. Morale plummeted. The tide of the war shifted. The war dragged on with few major engagements. Skirmishes occurred at sea. British and Spanish forces clashed in small colonial outposts. But there were no decisive victories. Meanwhile, in Europe, new conflicts emerged. The War of Austrian Succession began in 1740. It drew in Britain and Spain on opposite sides. The Jenkins Ear War, once a distinct colonial conflict, became part of this larger European war. By 1748, both sides were exhausted. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended hostilities. Most territories returned to their original owners. No major gains. No major losses. And Jenkins' Ear? It was never mentioned in the treaty. The war had lasted nearly a decade. Thousands had died. Millions were spent. Ships lost. Cities burned. But in the end, nothing truly changed. Trade continued. Smuggling continued. Tensions remained. and yet, the name of the war persisted because of a single, severed ear. It is likely that Jenkins never intended to start a war. His testimony may have been exaggerated. Some historians doubt the story entirely. But in the annals of history, it stuck. It became a symbol of imperial pride, bureaucratic madness, and the strange things that can trigger war. Today, the War of Jenkins Ear is remembered more for its name than for its outcomes. It is taught in history classes as a curious footnote, a conflict sparked by a bizarre act of cruelty. It reminds us that wars are not always born of strategy or necessity. Sometimes, they come from wounded pride, political theater, or a jar with a piece of flesh floating in brine. And sometimes, that's all it takes. In the long annals of history, many wars were fought over land, resources, dynastic claims, or ideology. But some conflicts arise from far stranger origins. The so-called Chernigov Dog War of 1861 is one such case. Though it never escalated to a full-scale military campaign, this peculiar episode from Imperial Russia illustrates how local grievances, rumor, and hysteria can turn into something resembling warfare, even when the belligerents are, quite literally, barking mad. Set in the Chernigov Governorate of the Russian Empire, now part of northern Ukraine, this strange story involved villages, local authorities, and a population convinced that the Tsar himself had been insulted by a dog. What followed was a farcical sequence of overreactions, arrests, and imagined conspiracies, leading to what was recorded, half seriously, as at Warv in Provincial Chronicles. 1861 was already a tumultuous year in the Russian Empire. Tsar Alexander II had just signed the Emancipation Reform, which freed millions of serfs across Russia. This decree was met with confusion, elation, resistance, and fear. In the countryside, misinformation was rampant. Many peasants did not fully understand the new laws, and rumors spread faster than official proclamations. Chernigov was one of the less developed, rural provinces. It was marked by high illiteracy, limited infrastructure, and deep suspicion of central authorities. In this volatile environment, almost anything could spark a crisis. The catalyst for the so-called war began in a small village near Chernigov, where a group of local peasants were gathered in a square. According to legend, a local noble had erected a temporary stage to read the Tsar's emancipation decree. As he began reading aloud, a mangy village dog started barking loudly and incessantly. Some villagers, already confused by the wording of the decree, believed the dog's barking was no coincidence. Whispers began, was this an omen? Or worse, a canine insult to the Tsar? A drunken farmer reportedly shouted, "That dog mocks the Tsar." Another yelled, "It's a Polish dog." A spy! Someone threw a rock. Someone else grabbed a musket. The dog bolted, terrified, and a group of armed villagers gave chase. In the process, a barn was accidentally set on fire, and a neighboring village misinterpreted the commotion as an invasion. They armed themselves and marched on the first village. Thus began the so-called Chernigov Dog War. Within days, over a dozen villages had been pulled into the fray. Rumors flew, the dog was enchanted. It was possessed. It had been trained by foreign agents. It was a cursed spirit sent to sabotage the emancipation. In some places, villagers formed makeshift militias to protect themselves from phantom dogs said to be roaming the countryside. Reports made it to the local governor. He dispatched a squad of gendarmes to investigate. When they arrived, they found barricaded hamlets, militia drills, and villagers refusing to cooperate. Many were convinced that Tsar had ordered them to find and execute the traitorous dog. The gendarmes, baffled, arrested several self-appointed dog hunters. They confiscated pitchforks, makeshift flags, and one illustrated pamphlet that proclaimed, "Down with foreign hounds." In St. Petersburg, officials were horrified, but also amused. The Ministry of Internal Affairs received a stack of contradictory telegrams about dog cults, peasant rebellions, and a supposed canine-led insurrection. Rather than escalate matters further, the government chose to quietly suppress the hysteria. They deployed clerics to explain that dogs could not, in fact, insult the Tsar. They distributed corrected copies of the Emancipation Decree. In private correspondence, one minister joked that they had discovered a new enemy of the state, the revolutionary dachshund. There were no real battles in the conventional sense. But numerous incidents did occur. In the village of Kulichivka, two families feuded over whether the dog had barked once or thrice. It ended with a mass brawl and 3 broken noses. In Ivanivka, a dog was captured, put on mock trial, and exiled to a neighboring village. A traveling priest was accused of smuggling anti-Tsarist dog breeds and was temporarily detained. At least one peasant attempted to establish a dog militia, complete with wooden muskets and a carved bone insignia. By the end of summer 1861, the madness had subsided. Clergy had reasserted order. Soldiers stationed nearby helped distribute food and information. The government quietly pardoned those involved, chalking it up to confusion. No official record lists the number of injuries, but no deaths were reported. One newspaper mockingly referred to it as the war that went to the dogs. The Chernigov dog war became a footnote in imperial bureaucracy, but it was not forgotten locally. For years, elders told tales of the barking revolution as a cautionary tale about jumping to conclusions and the power of rumor. Historians today view the incident as a case study in mass psychology and rural misinformation. It underscores how fragile communication was in the Russian Empire and how easily absurdity could spiral out of control. Satirists later used the story as allegory. One 19th-century cartoon showed a peasant army led by a barking general wearing a fur cap. Plays were written. The phrase "to go Chernigov on someone" entered local slang, meaning to widely overreact. The Chernigov dog war is, by any measure, a ridiculous affair. But it also offers insight. It shows the consequences of poor communication, the volatility of uncertain times, and the sheer unpredictability of human behavior. It's a story where no shots were truly fired, no territory changed hands, and no politics were resolved. But for a brief, strange moment in 1861, a barking dog brought a region to the brink of something resembling war. And that alone secures its place among the most useless wars in history. The Tonkin Expedition was a military campaign launched by France in northern Vietnam, then known as Tonkin, from 1873 to 1885. While it is often included among France's colonial ventures, the war serves as an example of imperial ambition far outpacing practical value. Though it eventually helped lay the groundwork for the French Indochina Union, the expedition was fraught with poor planning, excessive loss of life, fierce resistance, and questionable returns. The campaign's primary motivation was to expand French influence in Southeast Asia and secure access to China's trade routes via the Red River. What followed was over a decade of sporadic fighting against Vietnamese imperial forces and Chinese-backed militias, only to produce limited economic or political benefits for France. In retrospect, the campaign is often considered a textbook case of a colonial quagmire, costly, protracted, and mostly symbolic. In the 19th century, European powers were locked in a global race for colonial possessions. France, having lost its North American territories in the 18th century, turned its gaze to Southeast Asia. It had already established a presence in southern Vietnam, Cochinchina, and sought to push further north into Tonkin. Tonkin, centered around Hanoi and the Red River Delta, was nominally ruled by the Nguyen dynasty. However, the area was unstable. Banditry was common, and local warlords held more sway than the imperial court. France saw this instability as an opportunity to intervene. In 1873, French naval officer Francis Garnier launched an unauthorized military expedition into Tonkin. Ostensibly sent to negotiate trade routes, Garnier instead led attacks on Vietnamese strongholds, seizing Hanoi and other cities. Garnier believed he could establish a French protectorate almost single-handedly. His initial victories emboldened him, but he severely underestimated local resistance. In December 1873, he was killed in battle by the Black Flag Army, a Chinese-backed militia that would plague the French effort for years. Paris, alarmed by Garnier's rogue actions and the diplomatic fallout with China, quickly disavowed the expedition. France withdrew, leaving Tonkin in chaos. By the early 1880s, French colonial advocates had regained influence. Citing threats to missionaries and merchants, the French government launched a more formal campaign to subjugate Tonkin. In 1883, naval and land forces were deployed, resulting in fierce clashes with Vietnamese and Black Flag forces. The Nguyen dynasty was forced to sign the Treaty of Hue in 1884, establishing French control over Tonkin and Annam. But France's troubles were far from over. China, viewing French advances as a threat to its sphere of influence, began covertly supporting Vietnamese resistance through the Black Flag Army and other proxies. Skirmishes escalated into direct conflict, culminating in the Sino-French War. French forces clashed with Chinese troops in northern Tonkin and southern China. The most notable battles occurred at Bac Ninh, Tuyen Quang, and Lang Son. Despite several tactical victories, French troops suffered heavy casualties and logistical difficulties. The war ended inconclusively with the Treaty of Tientsin, 1885, in which China acknowledged French dominance in Tonkin but refused to pay reparations. Both sides claimed victory, though neither gained much. The Tonkin expedition was riddled with military missteps. Underestimation of resistance. French commanders consistently underestimated the tenacity of local fighters. The Black Flag Army, though irregular, inflicted significant casualties. Poor logistics. Supply lines were long and vulnerable. Tropical diseases like malaria decimated French ranks. Diplomatic backlash. China's involvement turned a limited expedition into a broader geopolitical crisis. Internal divisions. French political leadership oscillated between support and skepticism, hampering coherent strategy. Back in France, public opinion was divided. Some viewed the campaign as a patriotic expansion of the French Empire, while others saw it as a pointless entanglement. The deaths of key officers and lack of clear victories made it difficult to justify the campaign. By 1885, France had secured nominal control over Tonkin, but at great cost. Thousands of French and Allied soldiers had died. The Vietnamese economy was devastated, and anti-colonial sentiments were only just beginning to simmer. Economically, Tonkin did not yield the wealth France had hoped for. The Red River was not the trade artery they envisioned, and the region remained resistant to European commercial practices. Politically, the campaign marked a turning point in Franco-Chinese relations, introducing decades of mistrust. In Vietnam, it laid the groundwork for deeper colonial occupation, but also for nationalist resistance movements that would eventually culminate in the 20th century wars of independence. The Tonkin expedition is often seen by historians as an early example of imperial overreach. While it added territory to France's colonial holdings, the endeavor produced few tangible benefits and sowed the seeds of future conflicts. In Vietnamese memory, the expedition represents the beginning of a long period of colonial domination. For China, it was a moment of humiliation that further exposed the Qing dynasty's inability to defend its regional influence. French military and colonial historians debate the necessity and effectiveness of the campaign. Some argue it was a vital step in securing Southeast Asia, others consider it a prolonged skirmish masquerading as policy. The Tonkin expedition was a prolonged, costly effort to expand French influence into a volatile region. While it achieved its narrow objective, establishing a protectorate, it did so at great human and financial expense. More importantly, it demonstrated the dangers of colonial adventurism and the limits of European military power in unfamiliar and hostile environments. In retrospect, it stands among the most useless wars in history. Not because it lacked combat or strategy, but because its goals were misaligned with its means, and its legacy was more trouble than triumph. In the early 1960s, as the tide of decolonization swept across Southeast Asia, a curious and largely forgotten conflict unfolded between Malaysia and Indonesia. Known as the confrontation, or confrontation, the 1963 conflict over the Malay Peninsula was less a war in the traditional sense and more a geopolitical show of force fueled by ideology, nationalism, and colonial legacy. Despite the drama and military posturing, the conflict resulted in minimal territorial change and few long-term benefits, making it one of the most strategically pointless wars of the Cold War era. This chapter explores the origins, course, and consequences of the 1963 conflict, a war fought more in propaganda and jungle skirmishes than in large-scale battles. While not as absurd as some other conflicts on this list, the war for the Malay Peninsula earns its place by demonstrating how ideological rigidity and regional rivalry can turn a political disagreement into a drawn-out, fruitless confrontation. After World War II, the British Empire began to dissolve its overseas holdings, and Southeast Asia was a central focus of this decolonization process. Malaya gained independence in 1957, and Singapore was on its way to self-rule. By 1963, Britain supported the formation of a new federation called Malaysia, consisting of Malaya, North Borneo, now Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. Indonesia, under President Sukarno, saw the creation of Malaysia as a neo-colonial project. Sukarno's government believed the new federation was a British ploy to maintain control in the region and suppress Indonesian influence. Fueled by anti-colonial ideology and a desire to assert regional dominance, Indonesia opposed the formation of Malaysia. Tensions escalated after the British announced the merger of these territories into the Federation of Malaysia. Indonesia responded with diplomatic protests, and Sukarno declared a policy of confrontation. A campaign of political, economic, and military opposition to the Federation. The Philippines also opposed the Federation, citing territorial claims over Sabah. However, unlike Indonesia, it stopped short of military confrontation. Indonesia, on the other hand, began infiltrating guerrilla forces across the border into Malaysian Borneo and later the Malay Peninsula. Though officially undeclared, the conflict started in earnest in 1963 when Indonesian commandos began small-scale incursions into Sabah and Sarawak. These were meant to destabilize the region, support local opposition to the Federation, and embarrass the British and Malaysian governments. Over the next 3 years, the conflict saw over 200 armed incursions by Indonesian forces, many of which were poorly coordinated and quickly repelled. British and Commonwealth troops, including soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, helped defend Malaysia. The conflict remained mostly confined to the dense jungles of Borneo, where the terrain favored small skirmishes over set-piece battles. The few attacks on the Malay Peninsula itself, such as the 1964 raid near Johor, were military embarrassments for Indonesia, often ending with the swift capture or killing of infiltrators. Although the war never involved large-scale battles, it did include several key operations. Operation Claret. A series of secret cross-border raids by British and Commonwealth troops into Indonesian territory, designed to disrupt enemy supply lines and staging areas. Jungle ambushes. Malaysian and Commonwealth forces became adept at jungle warfare, setting traps and conducting patrols that led to numerous minor clashes. Air and naval patrols. The Royal Navy and Royal Malaysian Navy maintained coastal surveillance, preventing large-scale landings and stopping Indonesian supply routes. Despite the frequency of engagements, the conflict rarely escalated beyond these skirmishes. Indonesia lacked the logistical capability for a full invasion, and Malaysia's defences, augmented by experienced British-led forces, held firm. The conflict was as much about ideology and public image as it was about military action. Sukarno used the war to rally domestic support, framing it as a fight against Western imperialism. Anti-British rhetoric filled Indonesian media, and mass rallies were held in support of crushing Malaysia. In contrast, the Malaysian government portrayed the conflict as a defense of sovereignty and regional stability. Internationally, Malaysia garnered sympathy and diplomatic support, especially from Western-aligned nations during the Cold War. However, outside Southeast Asia, the conflict received little attention. With the Vietnam War looming larger in the American consciousness, the confrontation in Malaysia was often seen as a sideshow. By 1965, Indonesia's position was weakening. Sukarno's domestic policies were failing, and economic conditions were deteriorating. That same year, Singapore seceded from Malaysia, slightly altering the federation's makeup but not appeasing Indonesia. The real turning point came in 1965–66, when a failed coup in Indonesia led to a violent power struggle and the eventual rise of General Suharto. As Sukarno was sidelined, the new Indonesian leadership sought to normalize relations with neighbors and end costly, unpopular conflicts. In 1966, under Suharto's rule, Indonesia signed a peace agreement with Malaysia, formally ending confrontasi. The border returned to its pre-conflict status, and no significant political concessions were made. The war for the Malay Peninsula ended with almost nothing changed. Indonesia failed to stop the formation of Malaysia, which continued as a sovereign nation. The territories at the heart of the dispute, Sabah and Sarawak, remained part of Malaysia. For Indonesia, the war drained resources and contributed to domestic instability. For Malaysia, it was a baptism by fire, early years of independence tested by a neighbor's aggression. The conflict did, however, strengthen military and political bonds between Malaysia and Western allies. In historical terms, the conflict had minimal strategic value. It did not shift borders or ideologies, and within a few years, both nations resumed trade and diplomacy. Yet for those who fought and died, estimates suggest around 600 military and civilian casualties. It was a very real war. Several factors contribute to labeling the war for the Malay Peninsula as useless. No territorial change, despite years of conflict. Not a single square kilometer of land changed hands. No lasting impact. Within a few years, Indonesia and Malaysia normalized relations. The war did not prevent Malaysia's formation or expansion. Poor planning. Indonesia's military efforts were disorganized, lacking the infrastructure or strategy for a meaningful campaign. Symbolic politics. The war served more as a tool of domestic propaganda than as a realistic foreign policy. The 1963 war for the Malay Peninsula, though involving real combat, bloodshed, and international involvement, was ultimately a conflict without purpose. Driven by ideological paranoia and nationalist fervor, it left behind little more than memories of wasted potential and diplomatic embarrassment. It was a war where nothing was won, little was learned, and everything returned to how it was before. And that, perhaps, is the very definition of a useless war. Among the most bizarre and historically obscure conflicts of the 19th century stands the so-called War of Bogumbulla, a local tribal conflict turned farce in what is now modern-day Central Africa. The war was fought in 1857 between two small kingdoms, the Kingdom of Bogumbulla and the neighboring Kingdom of Mabutu. The cause? An elaborate ceremonial drum that went missing after a royal celebration. What followed was a year-long series of skirmishes, accusations, and misplaced retaliation that cost hundreds of lives, yet resolved nothing of consequence. This war, like many on our list, highlights how petty grievances, cultural misunderstandings, and pride can spiral into prolonged violence. Though small in scope and regional in scale, the War of Bogumbulla epitomizes the senselessness that can emerge when symbols hold more value than human life. The Kingdom of Bogumbulla was a small tribal confederation situated near the Ubangi River, rich in tradition and ruled by the aging but respected Chief Gomu. Music and ritual were at the heart of Bogumbulan society, with ceremonial drums occupying a sacred role. One such drum, known as Nyakaruma, was believed to carry the voices of the ancestors. It was played only during coronations, funerals of chiefs, and peace ceremonies. Neighboring Bogumbulla was the Kingdom of Mobutu, a more militaristic but similarly organized society under Chief Ngoro. Tensions between the two had long simmered due to disputed fishing rights on the river and access to salt mines. However, both maintained an uneasy peace enforced by mutual trade and the occasional intermarriage of nobility. In April 1857, a peace festival was held between the two kingdoms to celebrate a successful harvest and reinforce their fragile alliance. During this festival, Nyakaruma, the sacred drum, was played for the first time in nearly a decade. The celebration lasted 3 days, filled with dancing, gifts, and diplomatic exchanges. But on the morning of the 4th day, Nyakaruma was gone. Panic ensued. Chief Gomu believed the drum had been stolen during the night, and his advisors quickly pointed fingers at Mobutu's delegation. Chief Ngoro denied any wrongdoing and accused Bogumbulla of staging the theft to discredit him. The festival ended abruptly, and the delegations parted ways amid rising hostility. The missing drum, whether stolen, misplaced, or destroyed by natural causes, would become the spark for war. Chief Gomu, under pressure from spiritual advisors who claimed ancestral wrath would befall Bogumbulla if Nyakaruma was not retrieved, declared war on Mobutu in June 1857. Mobutu, for its part, responded in kind, accusing Bogumbulla of treachery and issuing a formal call to arms. The war began with border raids, villagers attacked one another's cattle, burned fishing huts, and disrupted salt transport routes. Initial clashes were disorganized, involving spear-wielding militias and war drums used more for intimidation than coordination. One of the first notable encounters was the Battle of the Red Shore, named after the blood-stained sands left by the skirmish. Despite its dramatic title, the engagement lasted less than an hour and left both sides retreating due to rain and confusion. What made the War of Bogumbulla particularly absurd was not just its cause, but how each side escalated the situation based on superstition and rumors. Reports emerged in Bogumbulla that the Mobutuan chief had sacrificed Nyakaruma to a river spirit. In Mobutu, tales spread that Bogumbulla planned to use black magic to curse Ngoro's lineage. In response, Bogumbulan shamans crafted ritual charms and cursed spears. Mobutu countered with protective amulets and water blessings before battle. There were even instances of night raids led by spiritual mediums instead of generals. Every small skirmish was treated as a cosmic sign. A failed ambush blamed on a lunar eclipse. A sudden downpour during an advance was seen as divine disapproval. Neither side gained any real advantage, yet both continued to fight in hopes of restoring balance. As with many senseless wars, it was the common people who suffered most. By autumn, food shortages began due to disrupted farming cycles. Trade routes collapsed, and local markets vanished. Entire villages fled deeper into the forest to escape looting bands. Neutral tribes in the area tried to broker peace, but their efforts were ignored. Chief Gomu refused to negotiate without the return of Nyakaruma. Chief Ngoro, equally stubborn, insisted on an apology for the accusation. Foreign traders, mostly Arab merchants and European explorers, took advantage of the instability, offering weapons in exchange for ivory and captives. The war, which began over a drum, now contributed to the regional slave trade. In February 1858, nearly a year after the festival, a traveling hunter discovered a damaged drum buried in a collapsed mud hut on the outskirts of Bogumbulla. It was identified as Nyakaruma. Apparently, during the chaotic final night of the festival, the drum had been moved for safekeeping and accidentally left behind. The hut collapsed in a storm, hiding the drum for months. The discovery was both a relief and a source of humiliation. Chief Gomu, rather than admit the truth publicly, claimed that the ancestors had returned the drum from the spirit world. He held a large cleansing ceremony, during which peace offerings were sent to Mobutu. Chief Ngoro, weary of the war and facing discontent among his people, agreed to end hostilities. A truce was signed under a baobab tree near the border, and both sides declared victory in their own oral histories. The War of Bogumbulla achieved nothing tangible. Borders remained the same, no new alliances were formed, and both kingdoms were left economically and socially weakened. The real damage was psychological, a generation of mistrust rooted in pride, superstition, and unresolved grievances. After the war, ceremonial drums were no longer brought out for festivals, but kept locked away and guarded. Religious advisors gained even more influence in political decisions. Meanwhile, local legends turned the War of Bogumbulla into a cautionary tale about listening too closely to spirits and not enough to common sense. Historians today debate whether the war should even be considered a formal conflict or a series of violent misunderstandings. Its absurd origins and minimal outcomes have led many to cite it as a textbook example of a useless war. No strategic value, no territory was gained, no resources captured, and no political shifts occurred. Rooted in error, the entire war was based on a misunderstanding, a misplaced object mistaken for theft. Driven by pride and superstition, the escalation was fueled more by saving face and pleasing spirits than by tangible needs or threats. Negative outcomes: trade was disrupted, lives were lost, and communities were destabilized, all over a ceremonial object. The War of Bogumbulla serves as a tragicomic reminder of how easily wars can start and how hard they are to end once pride and myth become more important than facts. Fought over a lost drum, it led to death, starvation, and regional instability. And yet, when the object was found, no reparations, no trials, and no formal apology followed, just silence, superstition, and another story added to the annals of pointless wars. In the often chaotic history of early modern Europe, few conflicts were as peculiar, or as patently absurd, as the so-called War of Cats and Dogs, a satirical name given to an actual series of feuds that erupted in 18th-century Galicia, in the northwestern region of Spain. Despite its comical title, the conflict involved real acts of violence, social unrest, and administrative turmoil, all rooted in petty political rivalries and class tensions. This chapter explores the so-called War of Cats and Dogs not as a traditional war with clear military campaigns, but as a prolonged and useless conflict characterized by intrigue, factional sabotage, and the weaponization of animal symbolism. At its heart, it was a war about pride, miscommunication, and the absurd extremes to which political infighting can go in a decentralized system of governance. During the 18th century, Galicia was a remote and relatively underdeveloped part of the Spanish Empire. It was ruled through a patchwork of feudal lords, clergy, and crown officials. Communication between Madrid and local Galician authorities was slow, and the region often operated with a high degree of autonomy. Local power rested in the hands of noble families, ecclesiastical institutions, and town councils known as cabildos. Tensions among these groups were common, particularly as Bourbon reforms in Spain sought to centralize control. These reforms included new tax systems, land redistributions, and attempts to regulate local governance, all of which angered the entrenched local elite. The immediate catalyst for the War of Cats and Dogs came in 1738 in the Galician town of Lugo. A newly appointed corregidor, royal magistrate, Don Ignacio de Zamora, attempted to implement new tax collection methods and property surveys. These reforms threatened the power of local landowners, who feared loss of privilege and autonomy. One such landowner, Don Jacinto de Calvo, responded with subtle defiance. He commissioned a mural on the outer wall of his estate showing a dog biting a cat, interpreted locally as a metaphor for loyal noble families, dogs, striking back against the meddling, sly royal officials, cats. Whether or not this was Calvo's intention, the mural was perceived as an open challenge. The corregidor responded by accusing Calvo of sedition, which sparked retaliatory insults, anonymous pamphlets, and ultimately, street brawls between factions loyal to each symbol. The imagery of cats and dogs quickly became rallying banners for the opposing sides. Supporters of the crown and the new reforms identified as cats, emphasizing their cunning and loyalty to the central government. Opponents, often landowners and rural clergy, embraced the identity of dogs, claiming to be protectors of traditional values and local rights. Cats, crown officials, reformists, urban merchants, and literate bureaucrats. Dogs, nobles, rural clergy, conservative guilds, and traditionalists. Political debates in cabildos turned into shouting matches. Accusations of witchcraft and heresy began to surface, particularly from the rural clergy who feared Enlightenment ideals creeping into their territories. Several municipal elections were disrupted by mobs dressed in cat or dog costumes. In some towns, opposing symbols were painted or carved on public buildings. Entire villages became factionalized, with cat-aligned and dog-aligned neighborhoods refusing to trade or marry between groups. Though technically not a war in the traditional sense, the conflict did involve violent skirmishes. The Battle of San Lorenzo, 1740. A group of dog faction farmers ambushed a tax convoy escorted by cat-aligned guards. No deaths occurred, but the convoy was looted and the town church occupied in protest. The Fire of Mondonado, 1741. A cat faction sympathizer's print shop was burned to the ground. Pamphlets blaming Jesuit dog sorcerers were found scattered near the ashes. The Siege of the Bishop's Garden, in 1742, the Bishop of Ourense, aligned with the cats, found his estate surrounded by peasant mobs wielding farm tools. Though the siege lasted only a day, it forced the bishop to flee and created a scandal that reached Madrid. Though no formal armies were raised, armed self-defense groups patrolled rural routes, and travelers began carrying badges to declare their factional allegiance. What truly distinguished the War of Cats and Dogs was its saturation of local culture. Satirical poems, songs, and plays proliferated across Galicia. Traveling performers reenacted fictional debates between cats and dogs, sometimes mocking the monarchy and sometimes mocking the local nobility. In some markets, vendors refused to sell to known cat or dog supporters. A new type of bread shaped like a cat's paw or a dog's ear became popular among partisans. These symbols infiltrated every aspect of life, turning daily tasks into political acts. A notable document from 1743 titled The Feline Manifesto outlined the philosophical basis for reform. It argued that cats were intelligent, adaptable, and worked in the dark for the betterment of society. The dogs replied with the barking gospel, a mixture of biblical allegory and political vitriol condemning cats as untrustworthy creatures sent to undermine Galicia's soul. The Spanish crown eventually took notice, not because of the political content, but because tax collection in Galicia had dropped to unsustainable levels. In 1745, Madrid sent a special envoy to investigate the situation. Finding the conflict too ridiculous to address with force, the envoy offered pardons and financial incentives to both sides to stand down. Crucially, a new corregidor, Don Álvaro de Saavedra, was appointed, a man with Galician roots and connections to both cats and dogs. he managed to broker a series of local truces, restructured tax obligations, and encouraged festivals where both symbols were celebrated as part of local heritage rather than political rivalry. By 1750, the War of Cats and Dogs had largely faded. Symbols remained, but their meanings became folkloric. Songs were rewritten as children's rhymes. Murals of cats and dogs became decorative rather than incendiary. No clear goals. Neither side had a strategic plan beyond defending their pride and resisting symbolic enemies. No material gain, the region suffered economically. Infrastructure deteriorated, and social cohesion was damaged. Fueled by ego and satire, the initial issue, tax reform, was subsumed by absurd symbolic warfare. Easily resolved, once addressed by a competent mediator, the entire conflict unraveled quickly, proving it was always more performative than principled. The War of Cats and Dogs was not a war of cannons or battalions, but a war of graffiti, rumors, and theatrical politics. It demonstrates how power vacuums, administrative overreach, and cultural pride can combine to create chaos over trivial matters. The absurdity of the conflict did not lessen its impact on local lives, but it does secure its place among the most useless wars in history. It stands as a reminder that politics, left unchecked and steeped in pride, can transform even the most mundane disputes into drawn-out, damaging farces. Throughout human history, war has often been portrayed as the ultimate expression of conflict, an unfortunate but sometimes necessary step toward progress, justice, or survival. Yet, not all wars fit this narrative. Some wars defy logic, lack meaningful objectives, and result in no substantive changes. These are the useless wars, the ones driven by ego, error, ideology, or absurdity. In this collection, we have explored several of the most pointless conflicts recorded in history, ranging from disputes over wooden buckets and murals to symbolic feuds rooted in animal metaphors. Now, in this conclusion, we reflect on what these bizarre, often tragicomic episodes reveal about the human condition. When we examine these wars as a whole, several patterns emerge that highlight their lack of necessity and impact. Many of the conflicts began over symbols, a bucket, an ear, a mural, or a name. These triggers often had more to do with ego or local pride than genuine strategic interest. The symbolic importance inflated the perceived stakes, driving people to violence over what, in hindsight, seems laughably trivial. A consistent theme is the failure of leadership. Petty rulers, overzealous commanders, or rigid bureaucrats exacerbated tensions rather than resolving them. In some instances, a simple apology or a diplomatic meeting might have prevented bloodshed. But pride, miscommunication, and a lack of vision turned manageable disputes into destructive confrontations. Several wars were used as tools of internal control or distraction. Leaders rallied the public behind foreign conflicts to distract from domestic failures or to consolidate power. The War of Bogumbulla, for example, was as much about internal tribal politics as it was about external threats. The War of Cats and Dogs in Galicia was driven more by local feuds than national interest. Even the most trivial wars had real costs, both human and societal. Innocent civilians were displaced, economies destabilized, and trust between communities eroded. The psychological trauma and cultural divisions created by these conflicts often outlived the wars themselves. Casualties, though not as massive as world wars, the fatalities in these minor conflicts were tragic. People died defending pointless positions or outdated notions of honor. Economic damage, infrastructure was damaged or neglected, trade disrupted, and resources wasted. In many cases, the regions involved took years to recover. Cultural consequences. These wars often widened cultural divides and hardened stereotypes. Even when peace was restored, resentment lingered. Many of these wars were driven by leaders unwilling to admit error or entertain compromise. The lesson is clear: humility, listening, and diplomacy are far more powerful tools than pride and posturing. In several conflicts, propaganda played a pivotal role in escalating tensions. From the murals of Galicia to the speeches of Sukarno, inflammatory rhetoric replaced dialogue. In a modern context, this warns us of the dangers posed by misinformation and media manipulation. A war over a wooden bucket or a pig may seem absurd, but these examples show how even the smallest sparks can ignite large fires when institutions fail to manage conflict. Effective conflict resolution mechanisms are essential. Perhaps the most glaring insight is this: war should always be the last resort, not the first instinct. These conflicts remind us that violence often creates more problems than it solves, especially when no one is entirely sure what they're fighting for. While many of the wars described in this collection occurred centuries ago, their absurdity is not merely historical. Even today, nations and groups engage in conflicts that seem driven more by pride, fear, or ideology than practical necessity. Border skirmishes, diplomatic tantrums, and symbolic sanctions continue to plague international relations. In an age of nuclear weapons and instantaneous communication, the stakes of even the most trivial misunderstandings are dangerously high. The lessons from these historical episodes should inform how we approach conflict in the present and future. Why remember these wars at all? It might be tempting to laugh and move on, treating them as historical footnotes. But these stories hold deep value as cautionary tales. They show how easily human emotion, poor judgment, and flawed systems can lead to unnecessary suffering. They also underscore the need to teach history critically, not just as a series of dates and battles, but as a study of decisions, contexts, and consequences. Understanding why these wars happened can help prevent similar ones from occurring again. In the end, the wars we've explored are not just about absurdity, they are about humanity. They reveal our vulnerabilities, our egos, our fears, our loyalties. But they also illuminate our potential. Each of these wars, in its own way, shows that alternative paths were possible, paths of peace, negotiation, and common sense. By remembering the most useless wars, we not only honor those who suffered pointlessly, we challenge ourselves to build a world where no one has to.